Hi there guys, Mike from MCQ Bushcraft here. Welcome to another episode on the build series. In the last episode we cut the sill, or rocker panel as it's known in the States, out of the Jeep and put in 2x6 box section to create a slider, and we tied that back to the Ruffstuff frame stiffener just to really reinforce and strengthen up that area. But I've been focusing on the front now, and we're kind of getting to a point where the vehicle's ready to be driven out of this garage and it's back on the road again, and I can get more into the gear that we're taking with us and water purification, storage, clothing, camping gear. But the front is well on its way. I've got one side sorted out completely, then we'll move on to the other side and get that one sorted. The lighting's going to be really poor, but I've got a high lift jack at the front. Down here we've got two axle stands basically, and one's supported on some blocks of wood. Obviously I wouldn't use bricks because they can kind of crack under the pressure. So I've got some tyres under there as well. They're not actually touching, they're just there in case something goes wrong. So I feel pretty safe working here. The vehicle's very sturdy. You can usually tell if it isn't because it wobbles horrifically, but this is quite rigid. We got a tyre on the other side, it's all good. And we're going to get that coil spring out and then the shock out. We're not going to use spring compressors, I'm just going to use a bar and just lever it out so it's under no compression, because those things are pretty dodgy. Almost. There we go. Your new home. There we go. Just checking the bearing for a bit of play up and down. Really, it feels like it has. It has. Oh, what? It has got a bit of play. The other one over the other side was pretty solid. This one, it's not that that's a problem. That's just the diff in there. There'll always be a bit of play. It's the fact that it can move outward like that. That's got to be changed then. Meg's going to be happy. More expense. So I've ground back everything to bare metal, and I've done it a little bit differently to the way I did the centre stiffener. If you remember on that one, I just ground away little patches where I was going to weld to. On this it's a little bit different. I just decided to do the whole lot, mainly to check the integrity of the metal, and I'm happy to say it all looks really good. A little bit of pitting here and there where the spot welds are in some areas, but nothing to really ever worry about in my lifetime. But we're actually going to paint this with weld through primer and spray the whole thing, so it'll be protected but also allow us to weld through it anyway. So that's why I wasn't particularly fussed about stripping it all back. And it's a little bit different to the centre stiffener. The centre stiffener went round underneath the frame, so you had to drill out drain holes. There's a possibility that water can get in between the two surfaces, so you had to be really careful when you fitted that and be quite methodical. With this it's not so much the case, because they're just side plates and they come in three pieces basically. You've got this piece at the front, then you've got this piece here, and then another piece just at the back that goes like that. So they're just plates on the side, so there's not a huge risk of water getting in between. And also, if you do what I did to the other side, which is use a tremendous amount of undercoat afterwards, you seal up all the gaps and it forever remains sealed. So it literally goes together like that, and then this piece has to be bent in. So we're going to need some clamps basically to pull this in. I'm just doing the bolts up snug tight, and one thing you need to bear in mind about this frame as opposed to on a standard XJ is it has tie-throughs in it, cylindrical pieces of metal that go between the two parts of the frame, so you can never crush the frame, and you can actually do bolts up very tight. So if you're putting these in and you haven't done that, don't do the bolts up tight or else you'll actually crush the frame. So we're all tack welded in. Managed to get it to adhere to the shape of the frame quite nicely. Using the clamps it pulled it in, and you can see that there's very little gap. Underneath the actual stiffener it's all looking quite good. And you just have to watch this lip up here. You see this piece of metal that comes down. On this side, not the other side surprisingly, but this side it's not uniform, so it drops down slightly here more than it does here, which meant this part here didn't work quite as well. I didn't want it on top of that lip because then you would have had a big gap underneath. So you do have to play about with it a bit, but it isn't that difficult, and using clamps you can get it to hug the frame. So I finished welding it in and it's all looking pretty good. It wasn't too difficult. The slot welds are alright as well, actually quite simple to do, as long as you focus on the metal behind and work down as opposed to up, which is what I'm used to. And I also put in a small plate as well, just to connect the two together, and I had to put a slot down it and bend it so it adhered to the slight angle, and then it's welded in. So I've stitch welded it all up the back there, stitch welded all along the top. You can see there in the front, obviously we've got the slot welds as well. I've reinforced it around some of the joining points and it's looking pretty good. It's in there solid. I'm just going to grind down a few of the bits that are sticking out now and probably just leave the welds there, maybe fill them a bit with some seam sealer and then undercoat it, and that's done. Some of you who are familiar with the Cherokee are probably wondering about one of the upper control arm bolt holes that isn't taken into account in this actual kit. I've left a small hole there just to mark the area so I know where to drill. So I'm going to get a 20mm drill bit and obviously drill that out at the end, but for the time being, because I've got a drop bracket set, you don't actually really need to access that, so provided it remains tight I won't have to bother with it. So after everything was filled, I let everything dry, sanded it down, primed it, painted it, and then gave it a good coating of undercoat. So a little bit like the other videos, we're actually in the future by about 3 weeks from when you last saw me in that clip fitting that front stiffener there. And there's a reason for that. Things got pretty hectic. Obviously time's against me. Me and Megs have moved out of our house, and pretty much everything we own fits in the back of the Jeep now. And we're living with my parents and her parents for a couple of weeks, and then when the vehicle's done, we're going to go off down to Wales for a week, basically live out of the vehicle, kind of dry run it, and then our ferry's booked for the 1st of May, and then we'll be on our way. So it's getting there, but I've still got quite a bit to do. In terms of what I've done on the front end, a lot has happened in those 3 weeks, and I've got quite a lot of clips, and I'll run you through it. One of the issues I had to sort out is where the caliper bolted to the steering knuckle. The thread had gone on the steering knuckle, so I had to drill that out. I welded in a nut and replaced that thread. Another thing I decided to address was the bar pin eliminators at the front, and I had rough country bar pin eliminators, and I wasn't happy with the geometry of the way they sat, and it stressed the bushes out and chewed them up. This is a bar pin, this thing here in my hand. And what you normally do with the bar pin eliminator is you cut them off, you pull them out, and you're just left with a bushing like that, and then you put a sort of hollow piece of metal tubing through, and then the bolt goes through that, and it sort of just, well, the bar pin eliminator gives you a greater range of shocks that you can use, so they're not vehicle specific anymore, but it also for me tidies up the mounting points in a lot of places. In these old vehicles they can be a bit corroded, and it just tidies that area up. But the way it sat was really kind of weird. So if you imagine this torque wrench is the axle, and you're looking head on the vehicle, it sat like that. So when the axle flexed down, it would do that, and it would stress the bush out really bad. So I've turned it so it's like this, and I've kind of permanently welded the bar pin eliminator to the mounting face now on the axle, and when the axle flexes it just pivots really nicely and doesn't wear the bushes out real badly anymore. So we'll see how that holds up over time, but I'm hoping that was a sensible choice. We also discovered that wheel bearing had gone on my passenger side in this particular vehicle, and we needed to get some new wheel bearings, so I bought 2 new hubs. Before putting those on though, I decided to pull the axle shafts, and I did a sort of unusual mod a while ago. Mainly I got advice from other people about this too on the Jeep Owners Club forum, and it's a good mod actually, and it did do what it was supposed to. But you probably notice I've got outer axle seals on the Dana 30 at the front of my Jeep. Now those aren't the oil seals. The oil seals on that axle are actually right up by the diff, and I put 2 brand new oil seals in this as well, because I had the whole thing pulled apart. But those outer axle seals had worn away, and when they start wearing away, what happens is they let water in but they don't let it out again, and that can be really bad for the oil seal, for the diff, especially for the carrier bearing, because that's right next to the oil seal and you can get some contamination getting into that oil, but also just for the actual shaft itself. If water gets in there, it's just going to stay in there, and you're not going to know about it until you take it apart or start hearing some problems. So what I did about a year ago is I packed the axle tube full of grease, and then put the outer axle seal on. I knew that would get contaminated, but the idea was it would protect the oil seal right by the diff, give it a lot of protection, because you've got all that grease to get through before you get to the actual oil seal. And to be fair, it didn't do too bad. In fact, in all honesty, I think it made it worse, because what had happened was when I pulled the axle shaft out, is the shaft looked brand new. That grease had done its job there. But where it had mixed with the water, what had happened was it had rotted out the oil seal, and then it had affected the side carrier bearing on the diff on the other side of it, and that had some rust on it and pitting, and it needed replacing. So I had to clean all that out, and I've got a special tool for that. It's basically a bit of threaded bar with a hole saw chuck on it and a wire brush. You send it up the axle shaft, clean it all out, clean out the areas where the oil seals mount to. I made a tool out of the old steering tie rod to hammer in the new oil seals, because that can be a bit of a tricky job when you're on your own, especially on the longer side of the actual housing. Got that all in there. So we've got two brand new oil seals in there. I had to get new side carrier bearings for the diff. I wasn't happy with the preload in the diff for the side carrier bearings. It came out way too easily, and I decided to reshim the whole thing, not on the backlash side of things, on the other side, which is where you add the preload for the bearings. All this stuff's in the manual. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but basically tested the gear pattern, tested the backlash. Everything was really good, very happy with it. Test run it, everything's running fine, and I decided to not put grease inside the axle tubes now, but actually rebuild the outer axle seals to make them even better. And the inner axle seals for the Dana 30 fit in as replacement oil seals for the outer axle seals in that housing that you can buy. You actually have to press them in using a press, but they compression fit in, and I put a big thick rubber ring donut inside as well, so you've got two oil seals, and it provides you with a much sort of tighter fitting hole around the axle shaft, so not a lot of water can really get past. And I've just put a little bit of grease in there on the axle tubes and around the oil seals, just a bit, not too much like I did last time. I think it was three or four tubes of the stuff went into it, but I'm really happy with the way it's turned out. So I've got new bolts, new bearing hubs, new brake discs, cleaned up the calipers, new brake pads. Also painted the front differential cover too, and decided to do the Pro Comp steering stabiliser because the paint on that flakes like dandruff, and it's just rubbish. So got that stripped off and painted that too. And whilst I was doing these jobs, I got a pretty good deal on some 12.9 tensile strength bolts, so higher than grade 8, and replaced everything under there with new hardware, new washers, all stainless. Even did the same with a lot of the self-tapping screws you get around the Cherokee, because they just rust, so why not put stainless ones in. One thing I did do as well was rebuild the track bar mounting point on the axle side. I noticed a slight ovaling out of the original hole and decided to rebuild it out of 8mm steel, also drill it out, and refitted it with an M12 10.9 tensile strength bolt as opposed to the standard M10. I also upgraded the bushes on the anti-roll bar, or sway bar as you may call it in the States, and they're poly bushes now to make it a more rigid ride on the road. And then one of the biggest jobs, in fact you'll probably already clocked it if you're familiar with the Cherokee, this is the old steering tie rod, and it isn't great. So I replaced it with a rough country one, and you can see the rough country one on there. It's massively thick compared to the factory one. It uses standard tie rods, and I guess that's where the weakness will be. It'll be in the tie rod ends now, not on the actual bar itself, but that has toughened it up no end. And to do the tracking, I strapped 2 planks of wood to each tyre, measured front and back, and got it all. I think it was about 75.25 inches, so it's equal now, and the tracking seems correct, but I will get that tested. But in terms of other things I've done, I had to put arch extensions on. I think a Norwegian guy actually said to me right at the start of the video, that's not going to be road legal in Europe because your wheels protrude out too far. And they protruded out 2.5 inches, which is even too much for this country. I think you can get away with an inch, but 2.5's pushing it. And I really don't like arch extensions. I think they look terrible. I bought some flexi arch extensions with wire in, so you can bend them to adhere to the shape of the vehicle, and they look really good for arch extensions, but I just don't like them. I mean, I could see on the Jeep's face when I was fitting them that it knew something was going on back there that was not good. So a lot's happened to the vehicle in this time, and it really doesn't end there. the front bumper needed quite a lot of modifying to fit, because that front bumper there, that winch bumper that I've got, actually sat flush with the original frame when it mounted on. So you're suddenly adding 6mm of steel either side. It isn't going to go on anymore, and it didn't. So I had to cut the mounting points, bring them out 6mm, and reinforce all of that. And I decided to build some high lift jack points at the front for that front bumper, so I could get the high lift jack under there, pick the whole thing up. It also strengthens that modification that I've done, making that mounting point a bit tougher now. And it just adds some side protection to the bumper. And even though it doesn't stick out as far as I'd like it to as a slider, what it will do is it means that when I get back from this trip, I'm going to make some tube steel fender flares for it, some arches out of tube steel, and it's a mounting point for that, much like the actual sill that we've made, the rock slider sill. To give the bumper a good home to bolt onto, I recycled an old C-Rock kit that I used to use on the outer of the frame, and used it on the inner of the passenger side of the frame on my vehicle as a bracing plate, along with some tie-ins that are cylindrical pieces of steel that I mentioned earlier that go inside the frame. And all in all, it gives it a very, very tough structure for sandwiching the frame. And on the driver's side, where the steering box is, I've obviously still got the original C-Rock reinforcement plate there that the steering box is connected to. So all in all, the bumper is acting as a cross member, and the frame is pretty tough now, along with the steering point. Another thing you'll notice is it's got the front runner Slimline 2 roof rack on it, and that's an aluminium roof rack, nice and lightweight. I was really happy with the weight of it. I didn't want a lot of weight up top. All the weight I've added to the vehicle is actually pretty low down, and that's kind of where I want to keep it. The roof tent's arrived too. It's in the back of the truck. Just managed to get it in there. There was nowhere else to store it, basically. So that's the front runner Featherlight 1.3. I think that's 40 kilos, that roof tent. Lightweight, along with the lightweight roof rack. So we've kept a lot of the weight up top as low as possible, really. And I'm quite happy with that. But I wasn't happy with the drip rails, or I should call them gutter rails, on the actual Cherokee. You probably noticed in the overview video when we were in that quarry driving around, I touched on the restoration work I'd done on the Jeep, and one of the things I'd done was restored the drip rails, basically, the gutter rails. Got those all cleaned up. There's a typical area on all these old cars, all these seams where you have two bits of metal joined together. They always rust. They were never designed to last, basically. So that got cleaned up about a year and a half ago, and I was really happy with the job I did. It looked great, but obviously some modifications took place, and I just wasn't happy with it. Just wasn't happy with it at all. I wouldn't even be happy with it stock, to be honest, even though I know a lot of people out there would argue against me, because they run big heavy steel roof racks with tons of kit on, hundreds of kilos, and they don't seem to have problems. I quite like looking at things from an engineering perspective, and I just thought it could be made better, basically. That's the bottom line. So I got some U-channel from a hardware store, 2mm walled, and cleaned up the drip rail, all the paint that I put in there previously. It was good to see no reoccurring rust, so that's obviously held up well. Stitch welded that in, and then I got a piece of rubber pipe, pushed it in the U-channel, and then fillered over it, ground the filler back with a sanding disc, and then pulled the rubber out, so it left me a clean steel U-channel, basically a drip rail. Painted it, got it all sorted out, made it look really nice, and the front runner gutter mounts slot into it really, really positively, and they actually just sit there because of the wall on the side, and it's just turned out really well. I'm really happy with it. Very solid. Made some changes to the actual mounting points of the front runner gutter mount, so it was mainly that piece that comes in the underneath like that. It needed to be changed. I've added two Allen head bolts that pull it in as well as pull it up, so it keeps it flush like that. They're actually made out of spring steel, so they flex a little bit. It makes it nice and tight, makes a good positive fit. So the next video will be me back in that quarry. I'm going to show you everything I've done to this in terms of like our storage and all the kit we're taking with us. Not in a huge amount of detail, but just show you mainly on the storage organisational front, what I've done to the vehicle, the roof tent, the roof rack, all of this gear. I know the lighting's not great in here, so I will do a video there and we'll summarise all of the work, and then I'll show you the gear we're taking with us. And then that'll be it. We'll be on our trip, we'll be camping, and you can see us doing that kind of stuff, and hopefully you'll enjoy that. It'll be very, very mixed content while we're away. The uploads will be as frequent as I can make them. But anyway, until the next time, I hope you enjoyed this video. Just want to say at the end of this video, a really big thanks to the guys at Ruffstuff. There they are. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you like this video. Appreciate it. And see you very, very soon in another one. Take care.